Now look, this is the part of the show where I normally give you a bit of a heads up about what we're going to be talking about this week, and warn you that if you haven't seen it yet, you should probably pause, watch the movie, and then come back so we can talk about it with spoilers. However, this week we're talking about Eli Roth's Borderlands, so spoiling the movie is perhaps an act of kindness. With that in mind, we're just going to jump right on into the discussion. In the words of Marvel star Harrison Ford, let's shoot this piece of shit. Preferably in the head, repeatedly, and thoroughly. In August 2015, Lionsgate announced that it was developing a feature film based on the video game franchise Borderlands. This made a great deal of sense. Lionsgate had just emerged from a sustained period of growth, evolving from an independent studio to what is known in the industry as a mini-major, off the back of the Saw and later Hunger Games franchises. The Borderlands announcement came just 3 months before the release of the Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2, suggesting that Lionsgate saw Borderlands as a potentially lucrative long-term investment. This was logical. Borderlands is a pretty big deal. Even as the resident non-video game guy here at Second Wind, I've heard of this video game. The franchise has grossed over $1 billion to date, selling more than 77 million units since it launched in 2009. In that sense, and perhaps in that sense alone, Lionsgate were onto something. In 2019, Pokémon Detective Pikachu demonstrated that video game movies could be good. A year later, in 2020, Sonic the Hedgehog proved, perhaps more importantly, that they could be profitable. However, Borderlands languished in development and later post-production hell. It was finally released this August, 9 years after it was announced, and 1 year after The Last of Us and the Super Mario Bros. Movie raised the bar for what such adaptations could accomplish both qualitatively and commercially. Borderlands was a spectacular flop. It was reviled by critics, and opened to just $8.8 million on a production budget of $115 million and an additional publicity budget of $30 million. It's really not great when Uwe Boll is dunking on you in social media.
Basically, my message is, fuck yourself.
So, how exactly did this happen? How did Borderlands end up this bad? Why is the movie such a disaster? Are we just going to keep asking rhetorical questions? This isn't a story of excess and ego suggesting classic cautionary tales like Heaven's Gate or Ishtar, or Waterworld, alternatively known as Kevin's Gate or Fishtar. This isn't even a study of incompetence or inexperience like, say, Amazon's absurd spending on shows like Citadel, a series so lavish that they shot it twice. In this era of industry uncertainty and streaming chaos, of mega franchise nostalgia and digital necromancy, there's something endearingly simple in the awfulness of Borderlands. To be clear, it's bad. But it isn't bad in some strange new way that threatens to completely hollow out the film industry from the inside. It's bad in the way that movies have always been bad.
Do it.
It's a bad movie that everybody realized was bad, and which they then made worse in post-production. The Borderlands film began gaining traction in February 2020, just a week after the release of Sonic the Hedgehog, and just a few weeks before the COVID lockdowns would shut down the industry and send many projects into deep sleep. Lionsgate announced Eli Roth as director, which might seem like something of a strange fit to those only familiar with his horror work. After all, Roth remains best known for his low-budget efforts like Cabin Fever or the Hostel franchise. However, Roth was a reasonable choice in context. In 2018, he directed an adaptation of the beloved children's book The House with a Clock in Its Walls, which starred Kate Blanchett and Jack Black, and went on to gross $131 million and a $42 million budget. Now look, Roth is a controversial figure. The internet can be quite hostile towards him. Personally, I death wish him well. More seriously, Roth tends to get a lot of criticism, and frankly, some of it is deserved. Roth doesn't seem to have had any particular affinity for video games as an art form. He's talked about being so inexperienced that he had to be guided through the Borderlands video game by Christy Pitchford, instead gravitating towards, in his own words, the same influences that inspired the game. Movies like Mad Max, Escape from New York, and Star Wars. As a result, there's already a sense of abstraction, with Roth more interested in the films that inspired the game than in the game itself. By most accounts, there was a push and pull concerning how faithful the film should be to the game. Roth stated that he didn't want it to be, quote, too slavish to the source material. Developer Randy Pitchford opined that the first draft of the script, quote, only resembled the Borderlands universe by vibe. The finished version isn't exactly rigorously faithful to the game, but it does contain a lot of fan service and Easter eggs, including, for example, the decision to dub the character of Krieg with dialogue lifted directly from the game itself. This is one of the original sins of Borderlands, something that would have doomed the movie even before the post-production quagmire. The film has no identity of its own. It's very obvious that the production team working on the movie don't have anything interesting or distinctive to say about these characters or the world that they inhabit. So, like any panicking student facing down a deadline, the Borderlands team mercilessly cribbed from a much better and more popular film, Guardians of the Galaxy. Now look, much like this isn't a video essay about Eli Roth, this also isn't a video essay about James Gunn. However, it is worth acknowledging that Gunn is one of the most consistently reliable blockbuster directors working today. It's disconcerting how much of that is down to the simple fact that he makes sure he has a finished script before he begins shooting. This is one reason why Gunn rarely does reshoots, which tends to make him cost-effective and makes his work more internally and thematically consistent. That is what you should copy from James Gunn. Instead, Borderlands just lifts whole concepts from Guardians of the Galaxy. So this becomes a story about a devilish space rogue wrestling with their mummy issues, teaming up with a dysfunctional band of misfits that includes a muscly guy played by a professional athlete, some computer-generated comic relief, and the daughter of one of the baddest guys in the cosmos.
I truly loved Guardians of the Galaxy.
To be clear, this is a fairly common move when studios license an adaptation of a work that they don't really understand. Borderlands misses the warmth, humor, or characterization that made Guardians of the Galaxy so compelling. These characters aren't funny, they're just unpleasant to be around. It seems quite clear that Lionsgate realized immediately that they had a turkey on their hands. Rather than just admitting defeat, the company rushed into salvage mode, committing to a series of reshoots. This is probably why Borderlands ended up costing so much while looking so cheap. It was essentially made over 2 long years, and the costs are inevitably going to accrue. There's always an uncanny quality to a movie where a studio has tried to run a salvage job in post-production. To the casual observer, there are a number of clues. So for example, to help excuse scenes cut out to get the runtime down, there tends to be a lot of expository voiceover. In cases where entire subplots have been deleted, you might recognize prominent actors playing disconcertingly small roles. You'll occasionally notice that the studio spent a lot of money on a big action sequence that isn't part of the narrative, so it tends to get folded into a montage, where it doesn't really fit. To cover up dubbing, there are lots of shots of the back of actors' heads as they speak. To conceal the fact that actors weren't free at the same time, they rarely share the same shot, even when characters are sharing the same physical space, say for example, driving in a car. Borderlands is particularly egregious even by those standards. By all accounts, there was absolute chaos. By the time the studio managed to actually organize reshoots in 2023, Roth had moved on to another turkey of a project, Thanksgiving. So 2 weeks of reshoots had to be overseen by Deadpool director Tim Miller. Craig Mazin had his name removed from the script, which is quite something from a writer who's credited on Chernobyl, The Last of Us, and The Hangover Part 3. In October 2023, it was announced that Steve Jablonsky had replaced Nathan Barr as composer. These reshoots just compounded the film's fundamental issue. Nobody knew what Borderlands was meant to be. To offer a very literal illustration of this argument, stunt coordinator Jimmy O'D has acknowledged the film was shot with an R rating in mind and then cut down to get a PG-13, which essentially renders its action scenes incoherent. This panicked post-production wasn't trying to unearth a hidden gem buried in a confused cut, but was instead just heaping even more nonsense on top of a movie that was already a mess. There is perhaps some small irony in the idea that a movie titled Borderlands should feel like 2 shapeless, formless messes heaped on top of each other with no boundary delineating them, making it difficult to figure out where the film's problems begin or end. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.